All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to my, oh, I forgot to pause. Good morning, everyone. Okay, that's about right. Yeah, it's a little early to be talking about DDD, right? That's okay. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Jimmy. You can find me on Twitter at @Bogard. This presentation, along with pretty much everything else I do, is on my GitHub at github.com/jbogard. There's a presentations repository, and that's where you can find every single talk I do, along with sample code and things like that. This topic, as long as a lot of other ones, you can find me blogging at that website there. And let's get started. So just to set some expectations about this talk, this is mainly an experience report of my journey with domain-driven design over the past 10 or so years. I had the privilege or so, I guess, of working with two very similar projects in the exact same space, set about 3 or 4 years apart. And so part of this is looking at all the bad things and wrong things I did with domain-driven design. And then I got to basically have a do-over a few years later, not rebuilding the same system, but a different one, where I got to kind of correct a lot of the mistakes we found with the previous one. I don't often get that privilege. Usually when I build a system, I try to build it for the long run, and any mistakes I make are pretty much in there, and I have to just wait for the next project to correct them. This is sort of a unique situation where it was a very, very similar domain, and I got to just basically have a do-over. It was pretty great. My journey with domain-driven design started probably around 2005 or so. It was one of my first major products I was working with, and basically the existing system was using things like type data sets. Anyone ever used those things? They were an amazing piece of technology that lets you use designers against your data. Now it's horrible. And so that reboot of that product, we were looking around like, well, is there something we can figure out how to better build business-oriented systems? And domain-driven design seemed like a really good choice for that. So this is about 10 or so years ago now. And throughout that time, from now until then, we've had number of different systems that I have put in production using domain-driven design. And so this talk is basically trying to sum up my experiences and my successes and failures with DDD over the last 10 years. So let's look at the first system that we were building. This was what is now termed as a Majestic Monolith. Has anyone heard this term before? Majestic Monolith? So this is a term from the Ruby on Rails guys to describe a Ruby on Rails system, basically trying to justify the kind of crazy code you typically see in there to say it's not a bad monolith, it's one of the good monoliths. And we built, in this system, this first system, we built one of the bad kinds of monoliths. But we'll just call it Majestic because alliteration is fun, right? This project started a year before our company came on. The previous vendor assigned to the project spent a year just building documents, just writing documents describing how the system is supposed to work, and had absolutely zero software to show for it. They spent a year just doing Word documents. And I think if I could describe a hell for myself, it would probably be a year writing Word documents of documentation. And so somehow they were able to do this, of building lots and lots of documents with no software whatsoever to show for it. They fired that vendor and brought us along to actually build something. And some of the interesting things about this is, one, it was the first agile project for any Texas government agency. This was a system meant for the entire state of Texas, and no one then had ever done any sort of agile project before. So that was a new one as well. And along with that, because they've never done agile, of course, so they've never done any sort of DDD either. So those two things put together meant a lot of new things for this organization. The previous system, I should describe a little bit what this is all about. So this system was meant to manage whenever a kid got in trouble, and you're arrested. There's a legal process as you move through the legal system. And so the system we were building was all about kind of tracking the progress of those cases throughout the entire legal process. And it was only meant for minors, not adults. So they had kind of different terms for things, a little politically correct. So instead of jail, they called it detention, even though it was a jail. Like there were bars on doors and everything, but they called it detention. And so it was really about trying to build a system to manage those kids throughout that entire process. Now, the way city governments work in the state of Texas is every single jurisdiction has their own IT budget, and they all build their own individual systems. So what we wound up having was, in the previous system, for all the different cities in the state of Texas, each of them had their own individual system about how to manage this process. The actual state government would have a set of laws saying, this is how the end result should look like, and then this is how things work in the middle. But the actual kind of business process of how things move throughout the system, it was up to each individual jurisdiction to completely make up how that process worked. So we had a number of really large constituencies, like the city of Dallas and the city of Fort Worth. Those two cities are actually only about 40 kilometers apart, but they both have populations well in the millions. But they have two very distinct systems. And now all the other large cities in Texas had their own individual system as well. And to help with all the small cities, the state of Texas supplied a kind of a pre-built, kind of dummied down system so that everyone else can use as well. So you had a number of different systems that all use kind of the same terms, the same legal terms, but internally, how the process worked inside each organization was completely different. And I kind of draw a parallel to something like e-commerce. A lot of companies I see sell stuff on the internet. When you get behind the scenes, the actual business practices that are driving those, driving the decisions and driving the processes are all 100% completely different. And that's exactly what we were running into. The new system, to replace all of these existing systems, would be, it's an acronym, of course, because it's a government sort of thing, would be the Juvenile Case Management System, or as we called it, JCMS. This new system was intended so that every single constituent group inside the state of Texas would use this one single system. And one of the big reasons for doing so is that, one, there were no actually connections between those previous systems. So the real example we run into is a kid would get arrested in Dallas, and they had family in Fort Worth, so the kid would move to Fort Worth, and they had no idea that he had a criminal record over in Dallas. Some of the worst examples are things like they'd go send him to live with an uncle, and the Fort Worth documents actually showed that there was abuse coming from that uncle, and we had no idea, none of the legal people had any idea. So there's an altruistic goal here, is to try to increase knowledge sharing between all these different groups, because the real goal of this system was to not have the kid get in any more trouble. So most of the focus was trying to have different various social programs to help the family and the kid not lead a further life of crime and get them on the right path in their life. This system will also cover every single part of the process that the juvenile could possibly touch throughout the entire system. And I actually have a diagram of this, and it's intentionally hard to read. This is a dumbed down version of the legal process. Within each one, there's obviously lots of different business processes. So you have something like here that would say something like grand jury, which is just a piece of text on this. The actual grand jury process in the state of Texas is insanely complicated. We went to one group to see how they scheduled this process, which is basically you have to schedule the court hearing amongst a bunch of other court hearings. And what the lady would do, she'd put physically all the case documents on the ground and physically arrange them to figure out how to best arrange everything. Because you had things like an indigent defense attorney, which is a defense attorney provided by the state. And you want to have to make that person come back and forth from their office, so they would try to arrange it by that. Or you'd see this kid had multiple counts, or perhaps he was in some certain gang, and then there's another gang that was on the same day, so let's have them on different, just all these crazy rules they had in their head is just represented by this one little piece of text on this diagram up here. Well, our system was meant to handle all of this picture. And it was a very, very, very big picture. So we started the project just bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, saying, we're going to be the first great Agile project in the state of Texas and the first great DDD project. So what is one of the first things you do on an Agile project besides write a year's worth of documentation? Yes. Yeah, motivational posters or demotivational, something like that. So the very first thing we did was create personas, Agile personas. This was kind of a big thing. This project started about 2007 or 8 or so. So that was one of the big things you heard back then, is you had to create personas for the different kinds of users that would be using your system. So we went through this process of creating all these different personas. I also couldn't fit them all on the screen because you couldn't read it. These are just a few of the samples of them. I got about, let's see what, 24 on this one. There were 72 total personas that were going to be using this system. And now this is the point where we should have seen maybe this system was going to be too big, but no, we were going to drive on. We were going to make this system. Part of the reason as well is when you're consulting, sometimes you can only push back with the client so much before they fire you. So this is another one of those areas like, maybe we should have more than one system. And they said, maybe you should shut up and just build it like this. Like, okay, thanks. We'll do that then. So behind the scenes, we'd have a lot of conversations about trying to figure out all these different kind of groups in the system. And security was defined based on these as well. Each one of these personas represented typically either one or a group of people inside an actual county. We also had sometimes specific counties, some of the smaller counties in the state of Texas. This entire box might be just like 3 people. But in other bigger counties, like in Dallas, for example, they might have a staff in the hundreds of people that were performing all these personas. So for someone like that, this picture made a lot of sense. But for a smaller group, it didn't make any sense whatsoever. But again, because we were building one system for everyone, we had to make a few compromises like that. Now, when you have 72 of a thing, that's just too many to reason about. So what we had to do was start to color code these different personas. These personas were actually, I wish I had a picture of this. They sell these giant Post-it notes. They're like this big. And we used those Post-it notes and put them on the wall of all these different personas. And this was like literally a whole wall that was filled with all these different things. And we wound up having to buy different colors of these to try to color code the different personas in the system. So we color coded them based on the different state agencies. I only have like 4 colors here, but there wound up being about 12 different colors in the end of all these different colors of these different agencies. So this, again, should have been the first sort of key in our brains that if I'm having to group different users in the system based on different kind of roles and responsibilities and having these major areas, maybe, again, this is too many people using this exact same system. So that was our first lesson. That chapter at the end of the book of the domain, has anyone actually read the domain-driven design book? Okay, who has actually read it? Oh, okay. There's also the DDD Quickly book, which again focuses on a lot of the things that aren't as important and skips the part at the end. Eric Evans actually did a podcast a couple years ago that was something like DDD 10 years later. And one of the things he described was if he had to do the book over again, he would have taken basically the beginning first 1 or 2 sections and cut that down to like 10 pages and put it as an appendix and take the part on bounded context and try to make that basically the gist of the entire book. And that was one of the big things that we learned from this project is that the bounded context are probably the most important parts of domain-driven design. And the other stuff is just kind of intellectual yak shaving sort of thing. Not yak shaving, bike shedding, bike shaving, something. that we just argued endlessly about. So the picture I have here is actually the picture from the production system. And each of those menu items is a separate state agency that is dedicated to that thing. And so once you got inside of that, that's when you had like, okay, here's the actual system meant for this individual person. I don't know what half of them actually mean. And it turns out the product owners didn't know what half of them meant either, because there's not any one person that has the entire legal system of the state of Texas in their head. So we had to pull and pick different people for these different areas. So no one actually knew how everything actually fit together, but there was one domain model that everything came from. In fact, the central domain model of the system, which was juvenile, like you had to scroll down for all of the different collection associations that were on this individual entity, because every one of these things was again a collection of things associated with it. It was absolutely maddening. So that was our very first lesson, that if you're going to do DDD, you should probably do a little bit of research on what those bounded contexts should be. We did not. We skipped it and just did one single bounded context for the entire thing. Another area where the cracks began to show were around some models in our system, especially when we had names of things that didn't mean anything to anyone, but we had to find some common language that everyone could share. So this is the concept of the ubiquitous language. Now, when we have dozens of state agencies across the state of Texas, if you try to have the term of thing try to be shared across all those different groups, you're just going to be giving yourself a headache because no one's going to agree on exactly what one term meant. And so what wound up happening in our system is we had to invent very, very generic terms, things like a person. Well, there's no definition of a person in the legal system of Texas, so this thing that was very central into our system, a person, actually had no analog in the actual domain of anyone's individual system. But it's what we had to do. One of the other things the system was trying to do was this idea of having one source of truth for basically the world. And so if you have the source of truth for the world, you have to have entities like person because you can't duplicate data across any bounded context. So there's got to be a single person that goes off the entire lifetime of the system. And so that's what we had here is a person. No one actually could describe what this thing was other than it represented a person in the real world. But what it meant in terms of the legal system never really had any meaning whatsoever. So that was our next big lesson in the system, is that ubiquitous language should actually be ubiquitous. And maybe if you don't know what that word means, go look it up and then come back and see if that actually corresponds to the things you're actually using in your system. Now, when we have all these different government agencies, one of the things that government agencies really do well is work well with each other, right? No, not at all. So these dozens and dozens of different agencies, we had a few main ones. First was the law enforcement agency. This was the people that would actually be the arresting officers. We had the prosecutors. They would try the cases against the kids. And then we'd have the court system that would oversee the legal process. And finally, the probation department. That's the juvenile probation department. This JPD people, these are the ones that were actually trying to help the kids. No one else gave two flips at all. Like the cops were just like, we're just out here. I was about to make a really bad joke, but I shouldn't do that. Filtered on, sorry. It's early enough to where my filter's actually still working, so that's good. So the LEA folks, they're just out there responding to calls and processing arrests. That's really what they're doing on a daily basis, trying to protect and serve, allegedly. And honestly, some of this, they don't even know if it's a kid or not because they just see someone getting in a fight, they don't have identification, so they get arrested, they take them to jail, and it's through processing that they actually learn, oh, actually he's 15 years old, so we actually need to go through this other specific process. So when we looked at, we went to these different groups and said, what is the thing you're doing kind of on a daily basis? What's the kind of most important thing in your life as whatever you're doing? So the law enforcement people said, the offense and the arrest. That is what we're measured on. That is what we report to the state. Everything revolves around someone doing something wrong and us arresting them for it. Courts, of course, is all about the trial. They're there to mandate and oversee the legal process. And again, they don't really care about what exactly is happening. They're just there to really follow the letter of the law. The prosecution office is really about cases. They're about managing a flow of a case through a system, either getting it to trial and getting some sort of outcome, or maybe having some sort of plea agreement, or dropping the case entirely. But cases are the most important thing. And finally, JPD, those are the people that were always asking the question, but what about the children? What about the children? That was just them. So again, a thing that we should have noticed is if we're asking each of these people, what is the most important core part of your daily work? And they'll have completely wildly different answers, then maybe we should go back and look at that bounded context thing again. But no, driving on, building the system like it is anyway. So bounded context have this concept of a core domain. And that was our next lesson, that if you are going to ask all the people in the system what the core domain is, what the core purpose is of the system, they should all have the same answer. And if they don't have the same answer, then you probably need different systems because all those different groups are going to have very competing concerns about those boundary points between those different boxes. So Going on, we asked the different people, like, what does a in this case a juvenile represent in your system? Like, what does that thing represent? The juvenile model object we had in our system. So I should say we had the person thing. We also had a subclass which was a juvenile. So we went through and asked, well, what does that represent to you? What does this juvenile represent? Well, law enforcement said form CR-23J. It was like a scene from the movie Brazil, literally. For them, they didn't really care about it being a kid or not. It was just this specific form that represented an offense and arrest. And that was all what they were about. I mean, when you hear, when you see like police procedural shows where they're not doing paperwork half the time, it's a dirty lie because they do nothing but basically fill out paperwork all the time of all these different things that are happening. And that was one of the major pieces of paperwork they had, was to fill out the details of an offense and an arrest. So for them, there was no such thing as a juvenile. There was just a form they filled out that described the incident that happened and what the outcome was. On the court side, a juvenile case was just something to adjudicate. There was really nothing else. They didn't really care much about the details. It was just, again, to try to follow some legal procedure. On the prosecution side, this was an offense was something to charge for. And that contrasted directly with the probation department, which was an offense being something you wanted to move past. So while the prosecution wanted to get successfully charged and convict the kids, the probation department had the exact opposite, where they wanted to drop the charges so it wasn't on their permanent record and try to get them down a better path in life. This is also this conflict back and forth is something that I'll talk a little bit later when we actually talk to the prosecution departments about the system and how much they hated us for this conflict we put in there. So, in addition to a ubiquitous language needing to be ubiquitous, the other thing we needed to have is consensus about a specific term. So on that illustration was the term offense and juvenile. If I asked every single group what that term even meant, they all had different definitions of that term. And again, if people can't agree on what a term means, then it probably have to have some sort of division of those contexts. Now, I have run into cases in which I have something that in the industry there hasn't been a decision on a sort of ubiquitous term for something. And so sometimes I do have to work with my product owners to help drive a consensus to say, okay, you're saying this word, you're saying that word. It sounds like those mean the same thing. Can you just use the same word so you're not confusing everyone? And then like a year later, it finally sticks and they start using the same word. And it's actually something I have to practice myself. Like I will subtly correct them, not overtly correct them, but sort of subtly. If they use the wrong word, I'll repeat it back, but using the correct word without saying something like, well, actually, or something like that. So it's okay if your domain does not have a ubiquitous language, a consensus around something, but you should be able to drive towards it. And if you can't drive towards it because the word has so many different meanings across your different groups that are using it, then again, you don't have one system, you have many systems. Now, the last piece is something I found that is kind of unique to the domain-driven design community, that most people are really interested in talking about the patterns of domain-driven design instead of those chapters at the end. And so this right here is actually a picture of one of the repositories in my system. You can also see there's no closing curly brace because it continues on down towards the floor and then over here, probably up the aisle a little bit as well. So there's a few competing patterns for the repository pattern out there. We use both of them in our system because it started during the time period where one pattern was popular and then continued on to where the other pattern became popular, so we wound up just using both. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what is the right pattern for an entity? What is the right pattern for a value object? What about those aggregates? How are we going to distinguish in our object model between aggregates and just other kinds of entities? And repositories. Don't even get me started about repositories. Let's make sure those are just right. So our system just really tried to focus on getting the patterns the way they're supposed to be implemented, as opposed to kind of taking a step back and looking at, well, barring any of those kind of patterns that we see there, What is the right way to model this kind of system? So if I had to do this part over again, I would not focus on the structural patterns at all. In fact, those are the kind of things that are pretty easy to refactor towards. So in my systems, I would just avoid putting any of those patterns in place at the beginning and wait for the code to kind of tell me that those patterns are necessary and I need to put them in place. We had a few of those in the book, the DDD book. They call the refactoring breakthroughs, and we had a couple of those where we'd have a Friday email saying, "Okay, everyone checking their code because we're going to have this refactoring over the weekend, and come back in Monday morning and everything's going to be changed." So it turns out that the structural patterns we put in place prevented us from making those refactoring changes that would have provided a much deeper insight into our system, because those structural patterns really kind of harden and ossify and solidify how you use your code. And if we were able to get rid of them, we would have much better ability to make those kind of deeper refactorings in our system. Not to mention just endless arguments about the right kind of repository, the right kind of entity. None of our customers cared about that. Like, having a better repository was not going to provide a better user experience or like prevent a kid from getting in trouble. So it was just a complete waste of time. So where did the system end up? I would still consider it a success because it's in production today. And it's being used across the entire state of Texas. But it's a very, very large system, and not everyone is happy with it. But they're a captive audience. They have to use it, so meh. It is a very, very large system. The final tally, and I just pulled this like a few weeks ago because it's still being actively developed and features added onto. 195 controllers, 652 actions, 121 different security roles in the system. This is because cities like Dallas have a lot of different people, and I just feel really bad for those like small East Texas towns that have to configure 120 roles to be like Sheila. So sorry, Sheila. 218 different entities in the system, 184 value objects, 352 enumerations, but we deployed to about 50 counties in the state of Texas at this point, and there's about 250, so about 20% of the counties and about 80% of the population of the state of Texas is going through the system. There are a couple rules in there, like if last name is Bogard, then go ahead and drop the case, but those are some Easter eggs. Does anyone have a system that's bigger than this in terms of controllers and actions? Okay, I've asked a few people that, and they're all like, no, and we shouldn't. That's not something to be proud of. Actually, we were proud of this. We actually had meetings with the ASP.NET MVC team. We had Phil Hack come down to our office. We're like showing him this, like, look how big this is. And it's like the biggest MVC app that you've ever seen. He's like, yeah. And then looking back, he had this like look in his eye, like we were crazy. But now I know, yes, indeed, he was right. Yeah, so I haven't actually met anyone that's built a system bigger than this, nor anyone crazier than us to build a system bigger than this. But I still, again, call it a success just because it went to production. And I've worked with so many teams that have projects, usually labeled Project Phoenix, that never go to production, so I don't feel too bad that ours actually made it to production. So the picture that is usually drawn by the Majestic Monolith people looks something like this. You have this lovely futuristic city, everything's nice and clean, and there's floating roads because those things are really easy to build and no one ever needs to change with the directions in places where those things are. But in the reality, it's more like District 9 sort of city, where it's just a complete mess and like aliens are eating cat food and that sort of thing. Just all over the place. So that was about 3 or 4 years of my career building that system. And then we get a call about a year after we were done with that project that we get to get a do-over. So we didn't get to replace the existing system and fix those wrongs because you really shouldn't do that anyway, like just rewrite a system because you don't like the code. What we did have, though, is an opportunity to help build the adult version of the system. So we built the kids version that has their own sort of legal process, and now we're going to be building the adult system. Well, it turns out that the group that originally contracted with us that built the juvenile system actually tried to build the adult system the exact same way and failed with someone else. And so they came in to call us to say, okay, we're not going to try to build the entire system. Not because it's wrong, but because we don't have the money for it anymore. We wasted it on the other one, but we only have enough money for this one little part. And that turned out to be a great big win for us because we don't have to worry about fighting them over. Let's not build a ginormous single monolith. Let's just build one little piece and do that one really well. So this project was way too costly, expensive, risky to build a single system. And instead of trying to build one system for absolutely everyone in the world, we were just going to be focusing on a single agency at a time. And the agency we're going to start with actually had the most money in the state of Texas because, believe it or not, they actually care about prosecuting people more than anything else in Texas. Like right below guns is convicting people. So those are the people that had the most money, and that's who we're going to start with. So in that original diagram, that meant that the people that we were worried about, oh, did you notice this was color-coded as well? So like people before us had already figured out, like, don't try to put everything under one umbrella. And so we just had this one section right here that was dealing with prosecution and those prosecution sort of services. Down here, this is the juvenile section. So the juvenile section with those hundreds of controllers, that was only this little sliver right down here. So like trying to get a single system for the rest of the adult system would have been absolutely impossible. So this new system, because we had learned our lesson and also because they didn't have the money to try to build the entire system, we had to build a system around bounded contexts. So we had a bounded context around a prosecution agency. And inside the prosecution department, that's when you had really good names for things. In fact, when you go and ask like the prosecution department, what is the most important thing in your system? Is it the defendant? No. Is it the, what's the opposite of the defendant? The plaintiff, thank you. I need to watch more Law and Order procedural shows, that sort of thing. Yeah, so is it the plaintiff? No. So what is the most important thing? It's actually the case, not the person involved with the thing. It's the actual case itself. That is the thing that actually moves through the system. A case represents potentially multiple offenses, multiple defendants, multiple plaintiffs, multiple offenses, multiple incidents, multiple arrests. This one folder, physical folder for some of these cases, represents the thing that moves through the system for that group. Now, outside of this prosecution agency, if you talk to what the law enforcement agency, courts, or some of these other people, like, what does a case mean to you? They're like, what case? I don't care. That's just something my prosecution buddy tells me over beers, but there's no such thing as a case in my system for like the law enforcement. We just have arrests, and we hand the arrests to the prosecutors, and they take them from there. As part of this effort too, we went and talked to the different prosecution agencies. It was kind of interesting because some of the prosecution agencies and the prosecutors used the juvenile system, and at the time we hadn't quite understood what we had put on people with this single Majestic monolith. And so we asked a couple prosecutors, we were the people behind the juvenile system. What do you think of that? Like literal quote to us. And that was a little bit of a shock, you know, I was the tech lead of the previous system as well, to hear people like use foul language for something I built and was so very proud of. And actually wrote, you know, dozens and dozens of blog posts about that system. And I still hear someone like, oh, that piece of shit. Ugh. Oops. So in this new system, the previous system was all about the kids. But if you remember earlier, prosecutors don't care about the kids. They care about the case going through the system. So that meant the view of the new system was all centered around a case. And in fact, the previous system, when you'd actually do anything in the system, it actually had to start with the juvenile. So the prosecutors, whenever they wanted to manage their cases in the system, they had to remember, like, what was the name of that kid that this case was about? Oh, I got to search for that first. Oh, then it pulls up the kid. Then I go to the little drop-down list, and it goes prosecutor. And then the prosecution section, there's this tab for cases. I click the cases tab, and there's a case entry. I oh, there's my case. Now I got to it. In the new system, cases were front and center in this system. So everything was about how they managed cases and what status they were in and how they moved through the system. What did I get in trouble here for? Burglary of a rail car. By the way, don't steal rail cars in Texas. That is actually a felony there, so just word of warning. So the concept of a case, because we were able to focus just on that core domain of that prosecution agency, meant that the overall system, the domain, the interactions could be much richer because they were able to focus just on that single bounded context. So this was the first lesson we learned from the contrast of the previous one, is when we have a very cohesive bounded context, that actually brought us a lot of clarity into how the prosecution agency works, to have even deeper insight to how to make their lives better, make their jobs easier. The reason why the prosecutor called our system a piece of crap before is because it wasn't built for him. It was built for the probation department. The probation department has no idea what the prosecutors are doing, and in fact, there's quite a bit of an adversarial relationship. Whereas the stories that the probation department told us were about how the kids' lies they've saved, on the prosecution side, they remember all the really bad cases. And so when I was able to say, oh, we helped this so-and-so kid, and he's able to come back with and some other kid killed his whole family, we're like, oh, fade into the background. Let's change the subject here. We also have to be very careful about the dummy data we put in the system. So things like Bart Simpson killed Maggie Simpson and did something with Homer Simpson. They would remember a case that was just like that. So oh, okay, we're just burgle a bunch of rail cars. Let's just do that, because that's no one gets unhappy about that. Now, the next piece we had was specifically around the roles and security in the system. In the previous application, we actually made all of the personas, the Agile personas, into roles in the system. And it meant that they had to configure 120 different roles no matter where they deployed this application. In the next version of the system, we modeled our roles and security quite a bit different. What we made was all of the permissions in the system were hard-coded. And that was because you couldn't just invent new actions that you could do or new tasks that you could do. So we had a hard-coded list of all the things you can do in the system. But past that, it was 100% dynamic. So we'd have a table for the roles that would tie roles to different users. And if you wanted to have different privileges, you assign that person different roles. And if you were some small East Texas county where you slip a 50 underneath the desk to get out of something, then you can just have one role in your system, which is boss hog sheriff or something like that. I don't know. And then that person can have all the permissions associated with that system. And what we did make hard-coded, though, were all of the permissions. The permissions in the system were also very task-oriented as well. That meant that every single permission corresponded to an individual activity that someone could perform. And then finally, when we went to enforcing the permissions, we would enforce them just via this kind of attribute we decorate on controllers. The previous system used role-based authorization, which I cannot stress enough, never do role-based authorization. It gives you no flexibility in how to associate those activities that people do to the roles. So we'd have roles in the system. There was something like, okay, this is Betty the bartender, because bartenders aren't used in the system. Larry the law enforcement agent. But in some counties, Larry the law enforcement agent actually was able to do this other thing over here. So we'd have to invent new roles. They're like, Larry the law enforcement agent, they can also do this other thing, except not that other thing because this other person complained. So instead of trying to force security through all those roles, we enforced them all through individual permissions. The other really cool thing we did with this is anytime you had a link on the page, it would check the controller action to see, does this person have permission to do that activity? If they didn't have permission to do that activity, the link wouldn't even show up for them. So we enforced it when they actually executed the action, and then we also enforced it in the system so that we wouldn't even allow them to see things and do things if they didn't have the privileges to do so. So with the previous system that had to be built for everyone in the state of Texas, it had to have this sort of infinite flexibility in some areas and then super, super rigid in some areas. So what a focused system allowed us to do is to be able to be flexible in the places we needed to and rigid in the others where we wanted to have some commonality across the system. We could only really do this, though, if we were to have that laser focus on a single bounded context. The next one was a fun one, the file management problem. So we went to I went to a number of different county agencies, but I went to the Dallas County Agency, the Dallas Prosecution Department, and went to the Fort Worth Prosecution Department. And even though the cities are like 40 kilometers apart, and you think would share a lot of information, they're actually in different Texas counties in the state of Texas, which means they have completely different IT budgets, departments. Like they don't really, actually, they kind of hate each other because the Fort Worth people are kind of hipster. Dallas is like kind of big city. They each think they're better than the other. So what was interesting is when we went to both departments and asked them, what is the #1 problem that you're running into that you want our system to solve? And they both had the exact same answer. We have a file management problem. Great. That's great. We have some consensus on something. Let's solve that problem. We talked to the Fort Worth County Prosecution Department and said, OK, can you tell me a little bit more about your file management problem? Well, it said their file management problem is they've got too much data. And one of the things they were doing very recently was having these police cars have the dashboard cameras on them to record incidents with a handy delete button in case there was something like you didn't want anyone to see. And this digital media would be submitted as part of the evidence. So you could actually see if someone got arrested or something, you'd have some sort of video evidence. And they also pull things from CCTV as well for convenience stores or the robbery. They can pull that in as well. And they're just piled up over time. So their biggest problem was we've got just so much data. There's archival laws that say we have to keep this data for like 20 years. And so we're just seeing this grow and grow and grow because as we get more and more digital, the world gets more and more digital, a lot of the evidence becomes more and more digital as well. And there's also laws that you can't compress things as well. So they have to have in the most raw format possible because, again, there's specific evidence laws for that. It's like, oh, that's a pretty cool problem to try to solve, that you've got so much data that you have to worry about trying to figure out how to store it and archive it and be able to pull it up efficiently. Now, going to the Dallas side of things, who also said they had a file management problem. This was their file management problem, a leaky roof. So their files were still paper-based. This was 2014, 2013, and they still had 100% paper-based system. Now the Dallas Metroplex is something like 6 or 7 million people, and just boggled the mind that in order to process all that, they were still going through paper-based documents to manage their entire process. And when you have a leaky roof, it can ruin your cases, literally. They would have times there when we'd walk in, and it'd be like sheer panic going around. Everyone's just like buzzing around like bees or something. And we'd be like, what's going on today? Oh, we lost a case. Oh, I mean, don't you lose cases on a daily basis? Like, no, we lost it. We can't find it. They're going around like desk to desk, like, did Jonah take it over there? No. I definitely put it back over there. And if they physically lost a case, it would have to be dismissed. Because that was everything was in that. There's no copies. That was it. So yeah, if like a leaky roof or someone physically loses a case, they would actually lose the case for them in real life. And they had stories of that where they've actually lost cases. So the amount of procedures they had in place to check out the case, put your time down that you checked it out. If someone will come at the end of the day, look through like who has not checked out a case or checked it back in yet. Did you take that home? You can't take it home because then who knows who can get access to it. So just kind of funny to think they had the same exact problem, but actually two totally different ways of working it. So this is the kind of thing we had to deal with. When we're trying to build a system that's going to work for both kinds of groups, one group that is heavily process-oriented and one is just heavily digital-oriented, how can you build a system with workflows that is trying to manage both of those different processes? This is one of the big complaints we had with the previous system. Because we're trying to build a system for everyone, it was impossible for us to get consensus about how the system should work. So what we'd wind up doing is saying, guys, we're out of time. We just gotta build something. So let's just do this workflow, and then you can tell us how it's wrong, submit a bug report, whatever. And that was one of the reasons they all hated us, is because we forced their agencies into very specific workflows that did not work for them whatsoever. So in the new system, we needed to build a flexible workflow that can work for both of these kinds of agencies. Now, yes, we would digitize these people over there, but again, they're so far behind the curve in kind of IT. There's the late adopter laggard, and they're like way off the end, like what's an IT department sort of thing. So we had to build a system that can handle both of these kinds of customers. So what we wound up doing is building a system that had flexible workflows in the system. So each individual agency could have whatever kind of workflow they wanted to in order to move cases through the system, and we wouldn't tell them or dictate them how that process should work. So in this case, we had dynamic statuses for where that case could be, because while one county could say, this is my business process for a case going through our internal agency, and another one say, actually, we just go straight from we don't have that person between the engineer and the customer, we just take the information directly from them. They can drive that workflow however they wanted to. We would have transitions defining a begin state and end state, and this is just a state machine, right? That's all we're trying to build here. And the last thing we did was we tied security to those transitions as well, so that only specific roles could potentially do specific kinds of transitions. So not everyone can just dismiss a case. It has to be like the chief prosecutor or whatever they'd have in there that could do that sort of activity. And because we still need to have some knowledge of like the base actions, we would still tie them into kind of a named action as well. So if it was a transition that represented a very specific thing in the legal process, we could have that in there as well. And finally, when some of the prosecution agencies need to have something very custom associated with it, we'd include different actions associated with it, so they could have like, this action needs to go to this custom page that has these fields on it, because when they approve a case for submission, they need to gather some additional information, so we were able to pull that in as well. The next piece we did with those different transitions is that we drove all the work via these queues. And this actually very well solidified in our head when we went to the paper-based agency. They actually had physical stacks of cases on people's desks that represented where that case was in the different processes. And so what we wound up doing is modeling that exact sort of domain, those exact processes in our system. So beyond just the kind of the legal model that we needed to model, so the case and offenses and arrest, we also needed to have a model for how their business process worked. Now, none of that model actually existed. It was just how they got stuff done. But we needed to have some sort of model for that in our system as well. So that was our next lesson, is that sometimes the model needs a model so that I can model the model as it goes through the system. So not every organization has this sort of issue where they have very dynamic workflows, and it's something I'm really hesitant to put in place, because I usually try to push the groups I work with to say, you really need to figure out what your business process is, and not just have kind of random things. If you don't have a defined business process, that's where you have like every entity has like a note section or comment section, and that comment section is actually where the business process occurs. Does anyone have comment section with like dates and names? And like so yeah, your business process is actually the note. So we wanted to take that and build a model on top of that so that we can actually enforce a business process through the system. Now, one thing very controversial, at the time anyway, I hope I've blogged and spoke about it enough that it's not as controversial. One of the first things I did was ditch all of those structural patterns from the get-go. My basic philosophy was, I will not introduce any sort of pattern or any sort of structure into my system until the code tells me that it's needed. And the code telling me that it's needed is I don't know, kind of like a horse whisperer kind of thing. Like the code has to speak to you somehow. But you can kind of just use the basic code smells from the old Fowler refactoring book as sort of a guideline to say, these are the things I'm seeing in my code. What can I refactor towards to help encapsulate those patterns? Now, one of the things that we had in our system was the idea of having requests and responses being the thing that we modeled in our system. So our original repository with those 80 different methods on it, each one of those methods is only ever used in one spot in the system. But when I actually went to the repository, it had everything, every kind of data access thing ever. And that's why you had that explosion of methods in there, because every single new kind of query that we had to do, we had to create yet another method on there, or just expose out a queryable and just say, F it, here you go, do whatever you want. So when we went to this new process, I did not introduce any sort of pattern until it was actually kind of emerged throughout the system. And the pattern we kind of landed on was this CQRS style application, where our requests and responses were modeled explicitly as individual objects, and then we would have the request handlers be the actual business logic behind the scenes. What this meant was we didn't have a single repository or a service helper manager object in our system. The business logic for individual activities would always reside in these individual handlers for a specific kind of request. So in this case, I'm handling a specific request to show, this is an index action to show, I try to pull one of the simple ones. This is to show the aliases associated with a person on a case. So it makes a query, does a list, does some auto-mapper projection because I was a tech lead and that's how I roll, and returns that view model to the end user. Now, however crazy this query would get, it would be 100% encapsulated behind this single class. And in fact, if we needed to drop down into raw SQL because performance reasons or whatever, that's okay because it doesn't affect the rest of my application. When I had a repository as that single interface that everyone used, it meant that I couldn't easily switch that thing out for something else. Because if I switched it out in one spot, I had to switch it out in every single spot. In this class, I have no abstractions whatsoever. I've got a real, in this case I was using an Hibernate, a real and Hibernate container, or a session, and a real, this is a structure map, I think, a real dependency injection container. No abstractions, nothing like that, just use the raw thing as much as possible. And if this needs to change, then I only have this one single spot where I need to go fix that. And we had those cases come up. We had some pages that the trying to go through the domain model to do my sort of querying that I need to was impossible. So we just dropped down and used something like Petapoco or Npoco, those micro ORM things where you're just using SQL. We can just use that in here instead. Or we can use, and Hibernate actually lets you do raw SQL as well, but it doesn't perform quite as well as the Npoco stuff. So we were able to do that in that one specific spot and didn't affect the rest of our application. So that was the next lesson we had, was to not blindly follow any sort of pattern advice. I often get questions asked like, can I build out a reference DDD application? And the answer is almost always no. Actually, the answer is always no. And the reason being is that when you see a DDD application, you're seeing the end result of hundreds of different conversations and decisions made up until that point. And there's a lot of assumptions that people have been making and a lot of things that have been verified that if you get to the end and just say, that's how we should do it, you're missing out on the important part, which is really the journey of how they actually got there. So when I see DDD reference applications, they're usually way too simple for me to even say, why would you even use all this structure? It's just way too much work. Or I miss so much conversation that I'm having arguments with myself like, well, I should have done it this way. Well, I wasn't in the room when they made that decision. I don't understand the constraints they were under. So I can't just blindly put all these sort of patterns and practices in place. I have to let the journey of the project tell me where I need to go. Now, when you build a system that has to, when you build a system that is not a single monolithic system with a single database, you now introduce a new problem, which is how to deal with others. Whenever I have now one system that has to talk to multiple systems, now I've got to worry about integration. This is one of the reasons why people typically don't try to go down the SOA, microservice, bounded context route, is because integration is actually really, really hard. And it's even harder when I'm talking about dealing with other government agencies that very often do not really like each other. The law enforcement agents and the prosecution agency really love each other. And we saw that a lot. Like, you can shoot and kill someone as a cop, and you probably aren't going to get prosecuted for it. That kind of buddy-buddy relationship. With other ones, they do have not so good a relationship, like the indigent defense, the defense attorneys that are doing pro bono. They're representing clients on the behalf of the state. There's not a very good relationship between these two people. Like, they don't go to the same bars, that kind of thing. And but we had to have a system that could allow each of these different people to talk to it. So we built, based on each individual use case, different kinds of interactions, different integrations based on those specific, how closely those two agencies work together in real life. For example, the law enforcement agency and prosecution department, beyond just being buddy-buddy in real life, there's actually a very strong relationship between those agencies in the legal system. So what we wound up doing is building a very special portal for the law enforcement agencies to come up. They'd literally come up to kiosks in the prosecution department, and with their arrest reports in hand, they'd be able to just look at them and type them in as quickly as possible. So on the prosecution agency side, we made things very lovely looking and user experience out the wazoo, all that sort of thing. The police department didn't care about that. All they cared about was coming in, typing their stuff as fast as possible, and leaving. So that's when we did have a giant form with 100 different fields on it, because that was the best thing for them. But we can only do that if we talk to them and said, okay, what is the most important thing when you're just doing this interaction with the prosecution department? We're not trying to replace your whole law enforcement system. Just this one interaction, what is the most important thing? And they said, to get in and out as fast as possible. We don't like typing. We already wrote this stuff once. What do we got to write it again? Can I just give this to a law clerk and they'll type it up? And the law clerk's like, no, you type it up. So we wanted to try to speed that process as much as possible. Something like the defense attorney side. This is really interesting because there's a lot of legal restrictions about what the defense attorneys can actually see in the prosecution system. There's certain discovery, I don't know, that's a word I've heard on Law & Order again. There's certain laws that dictate what kind of information they're allowed to look at. So in that case, we wound up building a completely separate system that used a REST hypermedia API, actually hypermedia, and that portal then communicated, and it was very, very blocked about what kind of information they can see just based on them being a defense attorney. Whereas the LEA, they can have access to quite a bit more stuff because there might be a lot of communication. Hey, did you have evidence for this? Oh, here it is. Let me go ahead and upload it. This was a very, very pinched portal. So that was our final lesson, that microservices and anti-corruption layers are your friend. Especially when we have to have integration between different bounded contexts. The way you can help solve these problems are building anti-corruption layers and then going back and really trying to drive towards this microservice concept so that each individual group can have their own system that conforms to their own individual rules. Final tally of this system. Now, it was a fairly large system, but I would say it only dealt with the prosecution agency, so I didn't feel too terribly bad. It had 70 controllers, down from close to 200 or so before. 600 actions, seems like a lot, but we had way more AJAX this time around, so it's a lot of control actions for that. A lot of permissions in the system because we're very, very granular about what people can do and not do in the system. Quite a lot fewer entities in the system, 139. 0 value objects because we were using Entity Framework and it doesn't support value objects, so nope. 80 enums, and in this case, when I pulled it up, this was about a couple months ago, we had about 20 counties in the state of Texas deployed with a prosecution system, and 20 happy counties, and that was probably the most important part. So if everyone remembers this picture, this went out on the internet, JavaScript the good parts versus JavaScript the definitive guide. It's like, aha, that's, this is actually the good part. It's just that little sliver there. Well, I guess it's growing now with ES6, right? So. And it had a similar thing with domain-driven design. If you try to encapsulate all the good parts out of the DD book and try to build your own book for it, it turns out that's actually just the microservices book. So if you want to learn what the good parts of DDD are, I would say just skip this book and go straight to this one. So thank you very much. If you want more information about this, you can find it on my blog or on my GitHub. Otherwise, thank you for coming and have a great rest of the conference.